There is something God has been watching that you stopped believing he could see. Not your prayers, not your church attendance, not the version of you that shows up composed and grateful and spiritually together. He has been watching the other moments, the ones you never told anyone about, the ones that happened in rooms where no one else was present, the ones you quietly filed away under the category of things I survived alone. He has been watching those, every single one. And what I need to tell you, before we go any further, before anything else, is that not one of those moments was unwatched. Not one. There was never a second, not in your darkest night, not in your most humiliating fall, not in the silence that stretched so long it started to feel like abandonment. There was never a second when the eyes of heaven closed. I know that might feel like a sentence. Right now, that might land wrong. Because if he was watching all of it, the thing that happened to you, that you never recovered from, the prayer you prayed in desperation that seemed to evaporate before it hit the ceiling, the years that passed without a single visible answer, if he was watching all of that and said nothing, did nothing, and let it happen anyway, then maybe the watching feels less like love and more like indifference. That is the hardest version of this, and I am not going to move past it too quickly, because the question underneath that feeling is one of the oldest questions a human being can carry. It is not really, does God exist? Most of you are not wrestling with that anymore. The question that actually keeps you awake is quieter and sharper than that. It is, does he see me specifically? Does he see me as more than a category, more than a number, more than a prayer request filed somewhere in an eternal inbox? Does he see me, the actual, complicated, weary, hopeful, disappointed, trying again version of me that showed up today? Does he see that person? I want to spend the next 40 minutes answering that with everything I have, not with platitudes, not with church speak that sounds true but lands hollow. I want to answer it with evidence, with scripture, with the kind of reasoning that holds up, not just when life is good, but when life has handed you the thing you were most afraid of, and you are still trying to figure out what to do with it. Because here is what I believe, and I believe it with everything in me. You are being watched. You have always been watched. And the watching is not passive. It is not distant. It is not the watching of a judge or a scientist or a stranger. It is the watching of someone who has been with you every step of the way, who has seen every version of you, who has never flinched, who has never looked away, and who has been preparing something in the unseen that your current circumstances are not capable of showing you yet. But before we get there, before we reach the part where the light comes in, I need to sit with you first, right here, in the real version of where you are. Because what you are about to hear will only change it if you believe it was written for you. And for you to believe that, I need to prove I actually know where you've been. So stay with me, because what's coming in the next few minutes is going to reframe something you've been carrying for a very long time. Let me tell you about a specific kind of invisibility, not the kind that happens in public, not being overlooked in a room, and not being talked over in a conversation. Those sting, but they heal. I am talking about the kind of invisibility that happens in private, the kind where you are alone with your own life, and the silence between you and God has stretched so long and so wide that you have started to fill it yourself with busyness, with distraction, and with a version of faith that is mostly performed and occasionally felt. You know the moment I am talking about. You have lived it more than once. It is the moment after the prayer, not during, not the amen, but after. That specific, particular stillness that follows when you have said everything you know how to say, laid down every burden you can name, and trusted in every way that you currently know how to trust. And then you open your eyes, and the room is exactly the same. The diagnosis is still the same. The bank account is still the same. The relationship is still the same. The feeling of being slightly out of step with the life you were supposed to be living is still the same. You prayed. Nothing visibly moved. You waited. Heaven felt like a sealed room with no handle on your side of the door. And what no one tells you about that moment, what most sermons and most devotionals skip straight past, is what it does to you on the inside. It doesn't just disappoint you, it starts to rewrite you. Slowly, quietly, over months and years, the unanswered prayers don't just stay in the past. They start to shape how you approach the future. You begin to pray with less expectation. Not because you stopped believing in God, but because somewhere underneath the faith you still profess, there is a bruise. A specific bruise, formed from the specific shape of the thing you asked for that did not come. And you learned, in the quiet, practical way that human beings learn things, to protect that bruise, to not press it, to ask for smaller things so the disappointment will be smaller. You did that. Most of you reading this did that, and no one saw you do it. You were faithful in public. You held the worship posture. You said the right things. But in private, in the honest interior of who you are, something shifted. Something that felt like hope calcified into something that felt more like management. You stopped expecting God to show up dramatically and started hoping He would just maintain the current arrangement without making things worse. That is not a crisis of faith. That is what faith looks like when it has been carrying something heavy for a long time without relief. That is faithfulness in its most unglamorous form, not the mountaintop version, not the miracle testimony version, but the version where you keep going, not because you feel it, but because you are not willing to stop. And that form of faith, the quiet, bruised, still-standing version, is the one that God has been watching most carefully. Let me be even more specific, because some of you are not just carrying disappointment in general, you are carrying it in a particular shape. The shape of a person who was supposed to stay and didn't. The shape of a door that was supposed to open and was shut in your face. The shape of a promise you made to yourself years ago about who you would be and where you would be by now. And the quiet grief of realizing that the gap between that promise and this present moment is wider than you know how to explain to anyone. You don't talk about that gap. You have learned to live with it so fluently that sometimes you forget it's there until a song plays, or a memory surfaces, or someone else gets the thing you've been quietly hoping for, and the gap opens up again, right in the center of your chest, without warning. This was not weakness, this was evidence. Evidence of how deeply you cared, how genuinely you hoped, and how real your faith was, real enough to be wounded. You cannot be wounded by something that didn't matter. The bruise is proof you were never numb. The fact that you still showed up to pray, even after the silence, that is not a small thing. That is one of the most profound things a human being can do. If you've ever felt like your faithfulness was invisible, like you have been doing the hard, quiet, uncelebrated work of staying, type "seen" in the comments right now, because what you are about to hear is going to change the way you understand your own story. You were never invisible, not once, and I am going to prove it. Now I need to show you something. And for this, I need you to look at a story you think you already know. Most people who have spent any time in faith communities have heard the story of Joseph. The coat, the pit, the brothers, the prison, the palace. They know the shape of it. What I want to show you is not the shape. I want to show you a detail that most retellings pass over so quickly it almost disappears. Because in that detail is everything. The text says that after Joseph was thrown into the pit by his brothers, after the betrayal, after the stripping of the coat, and after the sound of their laughter as they sat down to eat bread while he was down there, the text says the brothers lifted their eyes and saw a caravan Ishmaelites coming, and they sold him. What the text does not say is this: it does not slow down to give Joseph a breakdown scene. That should arrest you, because you would, I would, any human being would. You would stop the story there, in the pit, in the darkness, in the moment of maximum betrayal, by the people who were supposed to love you most, and you would have questions. you would have a crisis. You would need a scene where someone sits with you in the pit and explains what is happening and why. But the text doesn't do that. And I do not believe that is an accident. Because what the text is showing us, if we are willing to look at it, is that there are seasons in which God does not narrate. He does not stop the story to give you the breakdown scene. He does not pause the forward movement of your life to deliver a theological explanation of why the pit happened. He is present, he is watching, but he does not explain. And what looked like abandonment was actually an education. What felt like God's silence was actually God's protection of the very thing he was building. Because if Joseph had known what was coming, if the angel had appeared in the pit and said, "In 13 years you will be second in command of Egypt, and you will save millions of lives," it would not have produced the same man. The pit was not the interruption of the story. The pit was the story. The pit was where something was being formed in him that the palace required him to already have. C.S. Lewis wrote in Mere Christianity, "Imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house. You thought you were being made into a decent little cottage, but he is building a palace." That sentence is not comfort, it is confrontation. Because the implication of it is that the renovation is going to feel like demolition. That there will be seasons where God is not adding to your life, but tearing it out, tearing out the foundations you laid yourself, the structures you built for protection, and the walls you put up because you needed them at the time, but that are now in the way of something larger being constructed. You thought he was going to touch up the paint. He is rebuilding the load-bearing walls. And here is the paradox that I need you to hold. What looked like God leaving your life alone was actually God being most present in it. The seasons where heaven felt like a sealed room were not the seasons. He was absent. They were often the seasons. He was most active, not visibly, not with signs and wonders, but in the deep structural unseen work that determines everything that comes after. The silence you are in is not empty. It is full. What looked like rejection was actually protection. What felt like being passed over was actually being prepared. What you called delay, heaven called development. And every single second of it, the pit included, the silence included, and the bruised faith years included, every single second was watched, not from a distance, from a closeness that you will not be able to fully comprehend until you are standing on the other side of this season, looking back at the terrain you crossed, and realizing that you were never once crossing it alone. The God who watched Joseph in the pit watched you in yours. The God who said nothing while the caravan approached, said nothing while your particular caravan approached. And what happened next in Joseph's story, the thing that no one in the pit could have predicted from inside the pit, is what is coming next in yours. But before we talk about what's coming, we need to talk about what has been holding you back. And this is where the conversation shifts. Because what you are about to hear is not comfortable. It is necessary. There is something in you that needs to be named, not to shame it, to free it. Here is what I have noticed in studying the patterns of people who carry a specific kind of spiritual weariness. There is always a moment, sometimes so subtle you almost missed it, where you stopped waiting for God to move and started waiting for evidence that he was going to. You stopped living in expectation and started living in observation. You became the person who watches for signs rather than the person who moves in faith. And the shift was so gradual, so reasonable, so completely understandable given what you had been through, that you never noticed it happen. That shift has a name. It is in agreement with an old story. The old story goes like this. You prayed. Nothing happened. Therefore, either God is not listening, or he is listening and choosing not to answer, or your particular situation is somehow outside the range of his intervention. And from that old story, a whole set of behaviors grew. Quieter prayers, smaller hopes, and a version of faith that was more about maintaining a posture than actually expecting a miracle. You kept the language of belief, but removed the expectation from it. You said, God can do anything, and simultaneously structured your interior life as if he probably wouldn't. Now, right now, you are thinking that's not fair. I still believe, I still pray. Yes, you do. And that is exactly what makes this diagnosis so important. Because you can be genuinely faithful and still be living inside an agreement with a story that was formed in your pain and never revisited. You can be sincere in your faith and still have built your expectations around the worst thing that happened to you, rather than the promises of God. Sincerity and limitation are not mutually exclusive. You can be genuinely devoted and genuinely stuck at the same time. Here is how the enemy's strategy works from the inside. I want you to see this clearly. He does not come for your faith directly. He is far too precise for that. He comes for your expectations. He lets you keep the theology. You still believe in God, still attend, and still pray. But he quietly works on the interior architecture of what you actually believe God will do for you specifically. He lets you keep the roof of faith while removing the floor of expectation from underneath it. And then you live in a house that looks intact from the outside but has no foundation. C.S. Lewis wrote that the enemy's strategy is not a dramatic assault. It is a gradual slope, gentle underfoot, without sudden turnings, without signposts. That is precisely what has happened in the lives of many people watching this right now. Not a dramatic fall, a gradual narrowing, a slow agreement with a diminished version of what God is willing to do. The external opposition is real, the circumstances are real, and the disappointment is real. The world system is real, and there's pressure to be realistic, to manage expectations, and to be mature about what prayer does and doesn't accomplish. But the most dangerous of the three is the old self. The old self is the one who decided, at some point in the past, that it was safer to expect less. And the old self has been running your expectations ever since. The new self, the one God has been preparing in the silence, the one that was being formed in the pit while you were asking where he was, expects differently. The new self does not live inside the evidence of the past. The new self lives inside the promises of the future. And the single most significant shift that needs to happen in your life right now is the shift from the old self's management posture to the new self's expectation posture. That is not a feeling you wait to have. That is a decision you make before the feeling comes. If this is describing your exact situation, if you've been living in that agreement without even realizing it, or if you recognize the interior architecture he built in you, type "This is me" below. You are not alone in this, and you are not stuck here. So what does the path forward actually look like? Not in theory, but in practice, in your actual specific regular Tuesday life. I am going to give you 3 things, not principles, moves, concrete, actionable, doable today. And I want to walk through each one slowly, because the temptation in this moment is to give you a list and let you nod at it. I don't want you to nod. I want you to do. The first is this. Return to the moment you stopped expecting. There is a specific moment. You may have buried it so well that you need a minute to find it, but it exists. It is the prayer that wasn't answered the way you needed it to be, the door that closed, the relationship that ended, the diagnosis that came, and the loss that didn't come with an explanation. Something happened, and after it happened, your expectations adjusted. They lowered, and they have been lower ever since. What I am asking you to do, not as a spiritual exercise but as an act of deliberate courage, is to return to that moment, not to reopen the wound, to re-examine the conclusion you drew from it. Because in that moment of pain, you drew a conclusion about God, about what he does and doesn't do, about whether your specific situation is within the range of his intervention. And that conclusion has been functioning like a law in your interior life ever since, governing what you ask for, governing what you expect, governing how much you let yourself hope. And the conclusion was wrong. Not because the pain wasn't real, it was real, but because pain is not a reliable narrator of God's intentions. The pit in Joseph's story was real. The conclusion Joseph could have drawn, God has abandoned me, God is not here, or God will not move on my behalf, would have been completely reasonable given the available evidence. And it would have been completely wrong. You return to that moment not to relitigate it, but to revoke the conclusion. To look at it clearly, name what it cost you, and choose deliberately, as an act of will rather than feeling, to reopen your expectations to something larger than what the evidence suggested. The second move is this: practice deliberate expectation, not positive thinking, not the prosperity gospel. Deliberate, theologically grounded expectation, the practice of structuring your prayers around what God has promised, rather than around what you have experienced. This looks like a specific discipline. Before you pray, you name one promise, not a general one, a specific one, a verse, or a word that was given to you in a season when God was speaking clearly. You hold that promise in your hands before you open your prayer, and you let the prayer be shaped by the promise rather than by the circumstance. This matters because what you pray reveals what you actually believe. If your prayers are primarily about surviving the current situation, that is not wrong, but it is incomplete. It is the prayer of someone whose eyes are on the pit rather than the palace. Deliberate expectation shifts the prayer outward, not away from the pain, but beyond it. You hold the pain in one hand and the promise in the other, and you let both be present, but you let the promise be louder. There was a woman I know of, I will not use her name, but she knows who she is, who sat in a hospital room for 11 months, waiting for a diagnosis to change. She told me later that there were two versions of herself in that hospital room. There was the version that prayed, "Please let this stop." And there was the version she had to fight to become, the version that prayed, "I believe you are doing something I cannot yet see." She told me the second prayer was harder. It was more expensive. It cost her something to say it, but she said it, 11 months of saying it, and on the other side, and she is standing on the other side now, she said that the thing she would never trade was not the healing. It was who she became in the room. The healing was the gift. The person she became in the room was the purpose. The third move is this: let someone witness the real version. The enemy's greatest weapon in this particular season of your life is isolation. Not physical isolation, you probably have people around you. Spiritual isolation. The decision to keep the real version of where you are from the people who love you, because you do not want to be a burden, or because you do not have the words, or because the last time you tried to explain it, no one quite understood, and the misunderstanding was harder to carry than the thing itself. You were not designed to carry this alone. And I do not mean that as a generic encouragement. I mean it structurally. The weight you are carrying was engineered to require another person, not to solve it, not to fix it, but to witness it, to say, "I see you in this. I am here in this. You are not carrying this alone." That witness, the simple, ordinary, irreplaceable witness of another human being who knows the real version, is part of the mechanism of your breakthrough. Not all of it, but part of it. If this message is speaking directly into your season, if something in you is saying, "Yes, this is mine, this is for me," subscribe right now and write the word "ready" in the comments, because something is already shifting in you, and I want to be here when the door opens. Before I close this, I want to tell you about someone. She was in her late 30s. She had been faithful to God for her entire adult life, the kind of faithful that doesn't make the highlight reel, the kind that shows up on a Wednesday night when you are exhausted, the kind that still tithes when the account is low and you are not sure why, and the kind that chooses kindness in the moment when bitterness would be completely justified. She was that kind of faithful, and for years and years she felt unseen by God, unseen by people, unseen by the very life she was trying to build. She told me once that the hardest part was not the waiting. The hardest part was the suspicion, creeping in at 3 in the morning, that maybe she was the exception. That maybe God saw everyone else, intervened for everyone else, and moved on everyone else's behalf. But that her particular life, for reasons she could not determine, was outside the perimeter of his attention. She is not in that season anymore. What shifted was not a single miracle, though the miracle came. What shifted first was the thing I have been talking about tonight, the decision to return to the moment she stopped expecting, to revoke the conclusion she had drawn in pain, to deliberately restructure her interior life around promise rather than evidence. And from that shift, from that costly, unwilling, faith-expending decision, something began to move that had been locked for years, not because she finally earned it, because she finally stopped agreeing with the lie that she was the exception. You are not the exception. Now I want you to say this out loud, not in your head. Out loud, in the room where you are, in the actual air of the actual space you occupy right now, because there is something about a spoken declaration that does something to the interior architecture that a silent thought cannot. Say this: I am not forgotten, I am not invisible, I am not outside the perimeter of God's attention. Every season I have carried, the silence, the waiting, the disappointment, the pit, every one of them has been watched. Every one of them mattered. Every one of them was part of something being built in me that I am now beginning to enter. I release the conclusions I drew in pain. I revoke the agreement with the story that said I was the exception. I am not the exception. I am the evidence. And I am walking, starting today, in the expectation of what God has been preparing. Now hear me speak what I believe over your life as a prayer. Father, I want to lift up the person who stayed with me through this entire message today. I want to lift up the one who has been carrying a bruise they never showed anyone, a disappointment they buried in the back of their interior life and tried to stop pressing. I want to lift up the one who kept showing up to the prayer, to the faith, to the life, even when the evidence suggested they were on their own. You see them, you have always seen them. You have never once looked away. I ask now that you would do what only you can do: the following. Reach into the specific, particular interior life of this specific, particular person and begin to revoke the conclusions they drew in pain, not by force, by revelation. Show them what you were doing in the pit. Show them the caravan from your perspective. Let them see, even for a moment, the weight and the dimension and the eternal significance of what they have been carrying and what it is producing in them that nothing else could have produced. And God, I ask for speed now. I ask that what has been built in the silence begin to emerge in the visible. I ask that the door they have been standing in front of, the one they stopped knocking on, open. Not eventually. Now, in this season, in a way that leaves no question in their mind that you saw them all along, that you were there all along, that not one of their prayers was lost. I ask this in the name of the one who saw Hagar in the wilderness and called her by name, the one who saw Joseph in the pit and did not look away, the one who sees you right now exactly as you are and calls what he sees good. If this prayer landed for you, if something shifted while you were in it, type Amen below. And if you know someone who is in the middle of a season of feeling unseen by God, share this with them right now. You may not be able to explain why. Share it anyway. You might be the reason their season turns. You are not forgotten. You are not overlooked. You are not the exception to God's attention. You are the one. He has been watching through every version of your story, the versions you are proud of and the versions you would never show anyone. Watching not with judgment, not with distance, and not with the passive, indifferent attention of a God who is present but unmoving. Watching with the precision and the intimacy and the active, intentional investment of a father who has never once, not for a single second, in your entire life, looked away. That is who you are. You are the one he never stopped watching. Go live like it.